Okay, we're back for the second session of Museums, Cultural Institutions, and Social Impact, New York University School of Continuing and Professional Studies. In the first session, we looked at the idea of the museum in a historical context. And thought about the idea of that the museum has a social impact, in fact, has a history that's tied up in the origins of the museum. And while we can be very critical about the ways in which social impact is defined, um, the further you go back, arguably, the more limited um, who is defined within a societal construct is, but certainly it's part of the agenda of the museum, um, and sitting alongside other agendas and other forces, from power to aesthetic to values. So today we're going to look a bit more at the museum in a contemporary context, and we'll define contemporary in a kind of broad sense. So we'll quickly look at some 20th century examples. And I'll also, again, refer to some of my personal experience, which spans actually the 20th century and the 21st century, since I was educated in museums as a professional starting in the 1990s. But we'll focus then on a few frameworks that social impact is often thought about in a very contemporary context, meaning today. And we'll think about the museum as a forum and the idea of a museum as a site of dialogue or debate on civic issues. We'll look at different ways of thinking about the museum as a place that stories are told at different scales, from civic stories to exhibition stories to actually being a place to gather storytelling from individual citizens' memories. We'll look at briefly the notion of the museum as a site of conscience. We'll look at emerging cultural models that go beyond the museum per se, around the notion of creative placemaking, which has been defined by some as the possibility of ethical redevelopment. So we're actually beginning to look at the museum as a site that is a civic site, literally embedded in cities or other municipalities or small towns. We'll also look within the art world at how the kind of civic role of the museum has become taken over by artists in many ways, where they, through social practice arts, do the kind of community engagement that one might traditionally ascribe to a civic body, whether a community development corporation or a museum. We'll look then briefly, all of these we'll do very briefly. There's readings that are more extensive, but what I'm going to try to do is to tie together some themes and threads between all these categories that I'm mentioning right now. Public interest design out of the architecture and urban planning world, as a notion of the structures of organizations that we build themselves requiring a kind of civic engagement and citizen buy-in and participation. We'll look just at the notion of participation broadly across many of these categories, from the forum to the storytelling to the site of conscience, and certainly participation in design itself. And then we'll also look briefly at ideas in philanthropy. As museums are nonprofit, they're deeply tied into philanthropic thinking, in part because they depend largely in a country, talking about society, that doesn't have large public investment. How all these different threads can be brought together around some ideas about collective impact and collaboration as a key to making change among many organizations in an ecosystem doing separate things, and how to bring all those different actions and different interventions in a society together towards a common purpose. So with that, we'll start looking at some slides, and I will pivot to the camera because I don't love being on